The mysterious message. The message that changed everything came on a quiet Tuesday morning. At first, it looked like any other signal from space, just another blip on the huge screens at Earth's Space Communications Center. But this one was different. This one made every computer in the room start flashing red. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the head scientist, couldn't believe what she was seeing. This is impossible," she whispered, her coffee cup shaking in her hand. The signal wasn't just random space noise. It was a clear message, written in perfect universal code. Seeking personal advisor for the Queen of the Crystalline Empire. All qualified species may apply. Word spread fast. Within hours, representatives from every advanced alien race in the known galaxy arrived at the Space Center. The Andromeans with their blue skin, the tall Centaurians with their 4 arms, and even the cloud-like beings from the Nebula Kingdoms, they all came. But something strange happened. As soon as these advanced aliens read the full message, they left. One by one, they turned away, some even looking scared. The reason? At the bottom of the message was a simple rule. The chosen advisor must never attempt to see the Queen's face. James Chen watched all of this from his small office in the diplomatic wing. He wasn't anyone special, just a regular human diplomat who helped with minor alien trade deals. But as he saw all these powerful aliens leave, something inside him felt different. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the way everyone else seemed afraid. Whatever it was, it made him stand up and walk straight to the main hall. "I'll do it," James said, his voice echoing in the now empty room. "I'll be the Queen's advisor." The scientist stared at him like he was crazy. Dr. Martinez tried to stop him. "James, think about this. These aliens have technology we can't even understand, and they're all too scared to take this job. There must be a reason." But James just smiled. "Maybe that's exactly why it should be a human. We're not the strongest or the smartest, but we've always been good at one thing: taking chances." The next few days passed in a blur. James packed his few belongings while experts tried to talk him out of it. They showed him old stories about the Crystalline Empire, tales of advisors who went missing, of strange powers and ancient fears, but each warning only made James more sure of his decision. On the day the alien ship arrived to pick him up, it wasn't like anything anyone expected. Instead of a crystal ship like the Empire's name suggested, it was a simple black vessel, elegant but plain. As James walked toward it, Dr. Martinez made one last attempt to stop him. "James, please. We don't even know why the Queen needs an advisor. Why someone who can't see her face? It doesn't make sense." James turned to her, his small travel bag in hand. "Sometimes the biggest mysteries have the simplest answers. Maybe she's just lonely. Maybe she needs someone who will listen without judging what she looks like. Either way, I'm going to find out." The ship's door opened with a soft hiss. Inside, the walls glowed with a faint blue light, but there was no crew in sight. James took one last look at Earth through the Space Center's huge windows. He could see his reflection in the glass. Just an ordinary man in a simple suit, about to do something no other species dared to do. As he stepped into the ship, he didn't see the shadow figures watching from the ship's hidden cameras. He didn't hear their whispered conversations or see their worried faces. And he certainly didn't know that his simple decision to accept this job would change the fate of 2 species forever. The ship's door closed behind him with a final click. As the engines hummed to life, James sat in the comfortable passenger seat, looking out at the stars. He pulled out a small notebook, an actual paper one, because some habits were hard to break, and wrote his first entry. Day 1. They say the Queen of the Crystalline Empire is dangerous. They say no one who sees her face survives. But sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't what you can see, it's what you can't. I guess I'm about to find out why. The ship lifted off, carrying James toward his new life. Little did he know, the real mystery wasn't why no one could see the Queen's face. The real mystery was why, Out of all the species in the galaxy, she had hoped a human would answer her call. The Unseen Court. The journey to the crystalline empire took 7 Earth days, but James Chen hardly noticed the time pass. Every window of the ship showed him wonders he had never imagined. Stars in colors that didn't exist on Earth, space creatures that looked like dancing ribbons of light, and giant fields of floating crystals that sang when the ship passed through them. On the 8th day, James woke up to find the ship completely dark. Just as panic started to creep in, a soft voice filled the room. It wasn't human, but it wasn't exactly alien either. It sounded like wind chimes mixed with whispers. "Please remain calm, Advisor Chen. We are entering the Veil of Shadows. It protects our palace from unfriendly eyes." The darkness lasted for exactly 17 minutes. James counted every second. When light returned, he rushed to the window and froze. Below them was something impossible. The palace wasn't made of crystal as everyone expected. Instead, it was made of what looked like liquid starlight. The walls flowed like water but sparkled like diamonds. Gardens floated in the air, full of plants that changed colors as you watched them. But the strangest thing, every single window was covered with what looked like moving shadows. As the ship landed, James noticed something else odd. There were no other ships around. No traffic. No buzz of activity you'd expect at a royal palace. It was like landing in the middle of a beautiful ghost town. A door appeared in the ship's wall. James was sure it hadn't been there before. Beyond it stood 2 figures in flowing robes that seemed to be made of the same moving shadows that covered the windows. Their faces were hidden behind masks that looked like swirling galaxies. "Welcome, Advisor Chen," the taller figure said. "I am Keeper Vex, and this is Keeper Lux. We maintain the Queen's privacy." James noticed they didn't offer to shake hands. In fact, they kept exactly 7 steps away from him at all times. "The Queen awaits you in the advisory chamber," Keeper Lux said, her voice sounding like distant bells. "But first, you must accept the 3 rules of service." James nodded, remembering his diplomatic training. Always know the rules before you agree to anything. Rule 1, Vex began. You must never attempt to see the Queen's face. Not directly, not through reflection, not through any means. Rule 2, Lux continued. You must wear this at all times. She held out what looked like a simple silver bracelet. But when James put it on, he felt a strange tingling sensation. "It will let us know if you ever face the wrong direction when the Queen is present," Vex explained. "And Rule 3, James asked." Both keepers spoke in perfect unison. Never enter the shadow gardens between midnight and dawn. Before James could ask about this strange 3rd rule, they led him through corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves as they walked. The walls whispered in languages he didn't understand. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of other palace staff, all wearing those galaxy masks, all keeping their exact distance from him. Finally, they reached a massive door made of what looked like black ice. As it opened, James saw a large circular room. One half was filled with screens, computers, and communication devices from every known civilization. The other half was separated by what looked like a waterfall of darkness. "The Queen speaks from behind the veil," Lux explained. "She will hear you. You will hear her. That is enough." Just then, James noticed something on a nearby desk. An old leather-bound book, its pages yellow with age. As the keepers turned to leave, he quickly read the first line written in shaky handwriting. Day 47. I found out why they call it the Crystalline Empire, and it has nothing to do with the palace. But before he could read more, the book vanished, simply faded away like mist. And then, from behind the dark waterfall, a voice spoke. It was the most beautiful and most terrifying sound James had ever heard. "Welcome, James Chen of Earth. I have waited a very long time for someone like you." The Queen's voice echoed in the room, but James noticed something strange. The shadows on the walls seemed to lean away from her voice, like even they were afraid. And somewhere, in a distant part of the palace, Warning bells began to ring. In his pocket, James felt his notebook grow strangely warm. When he pulled it out later, he would find new words had appeared on its pages, words written in crystal ink that glowed in the dark. Some secrets are kept not to hide the truth, but to protect it. Choose wisely, James Chen. Not all is shadowed in the court of light. Growing trust. 1 month into his role as advisor, James Chen discovered something unexpected about the Queen. She loved Earth jokes, especially bad ones. "What do you call a star that doesn't shine?" James asked one morning during their daily meeting. From behind the shadow waterfall came a sound he'd never heard before, the Queen's laugh. It sounded like crystal wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "I don't know, James. What do you call it?" "A black hole in one." The Queen's laughter echoed through the chamber, and James noticed something amazing. When she laughed, tiny points of light danced in the shadow waterfall, like stars being born. Their relationship had grown in strange and wonderful ways. While other advisors cowered behind screens to give their reports, James sat comfortably in his chair, sharing stories about Earth while helping the Queen with galactic politics. He learned that she loved hearing about simple things: rain, snow, children playing in parks. But not everything in the palace was going well. James kept finding odd things in his room. Ancient scrolls written in crystal ink that vanished when he tried to read them, strange symbols that appeared on his walls at night, and once, a crystal flower that sang sad songs when moonlight touched it. The keepers watched him more closely now. Their galaxy masks seemed to swirl faster when he walked past, and they whispered in their chime-like language when they thought he couldn't hear. One night, unable to sleep, James broke Rule 3. He went to the shadow gardens between midnight and dawn. What he found there changed everything. The garden was alive with impossible things. Trees made of living darkness swayed without wind. Flowers bloomed with petals of pure light, then collapsed into black holes before blooming again. But strangest of all were the crystals growing everywhere, crystals that showed reflections of people who weren't there. In one crystal, James saw an old advisor running in terror. In another, he saw a young alien queen crying tears of light. But before he could look closer, he heard the warning bells. Red lights flashed throughout the palace. The Queen's voice, urgent and afraid, echoed through hidden speakers. "James, run to the advisory chamber. Now." He ran through corridors that rearranged themselves, following paths that hadn't existed before. When he reached the chamber, he found chaos. 3 assassins had broken in, their bodies made of some kind of living smoke. They were trying to force their way through the shadow waterfall, but couldn't pass through it. "James," the Queen called out, "the control panel to your left. Press the crystal that feels warm." Without hesitation, James ran to the panel. Among hundreds of crystals, one felt warm under his touch. When he pressed it, something incredible happened. The shadow waterfall parted slightly, and from it emerged a hand, made of pure light and more beautiful than anything James had ever seen. The hand drew symbols in the air, and the smoke assassins screamed in voices that sounded like dying stars before vanishing. In the silence that followed, James heard the Queen crying softly. "Are you all right?" he asked, stepping closer to the waterfall than ever before. "Why didn't you run away?" Her voice shook. "When you heard the bells, when you saw the danger, why did you come here instead of saving yourself?" James smiled, even though he knew she could see it. "Because that's what friends do." "Friends?" The word seemed to echo strangely in the room. "No advisor has ever called me that before." Later that night, James found new writing in his notebook. But this time, it wasn't the usual crystal ink. These words seemed to be written in captured starlight. "The curse of the crystalline empire is not what they think. It is not that we kill with a glance. It is that we show the truth, and some truths are too beautiful for mortal eyes to bear." Below these words was a drawing of a crystal flower, exactly like the ones in the shadow garden. But this one had a note beside it. "Some flowers bloom only in darkness, not because they fear the light, but because they are the light. As James stared at these words, somewhere in the palace, the keepers held an urgent meeting. In their private chamber, they removed their masks, revealing faces that would have driven any other species mad with their beauty. And they worried, because they saw something happening that had never happened before. The shadows in the palace were starting to respond to James, not just when he was near the queen, but all the time, as if the darkness itself had decided he was worthy of its trust. And in her private chambers, behind veils of shadow and walls of light, the queen looked at her reflection for the first time in 1,000 years. In the mirror, her face shone with a light that could drive worlds to war or bring galaxies to their knees in worship. But when she thought of James, his jokes, his kindness, his trust, she saw something new in her reflection. For the first time since taking the throne, she saw hope. The plot thickens. The news spread across the galaxy like wildfire. A human had survived 3 months as the Queen's advisor. Not only survived, but thrived. The impossible was happening in the crystalline empire, and no one knew what to make of it. James noticed the changes first in small ways. The shadow creatures in the garden started following him like pets. His silver bracelet sometimes glowed with strange patterns that looked like star maps. And most surprisingly, other aliens started avoiding him in the palace corridors, as if he carried some kind of invisible mark. One morning, while sorting through galactic trade agreements, James heard something odd. The shadow waterfall was humming. Not its usual soft whisper, but a melody that made his teeth ache and his heart feel heavy. "What's wrong?" he asked the queen, setting aside his work. He'd learned to read her moods in the way the shadows moved. "The Council of Elder Races is demanding a meeting," she said, her voice tight with worry. They say our friendship is dangerous." Before James could respond, his notebook began to glow. New words appeared on its pages, writing themselves in shimmering ink. Warning: the light that brings truth can also bring blindness. The elder races remember what we choose to forget. Just then, Keeper Vex burst into the room, his galaxy mask spinning faster than James had ever seen. "My queen, they're here. All 12 elder races." Through the palace windows, James saw them arrive. Their ships were ancient things, each one unique and impossible. One looked like a folded piece of space itself. Another seemed to be made of frozen time. A third was simply a gap in reality, a ship-shaped hole in the universe. The elder races entered the palace without waiting for permission. They were creatures of myth, beings so old they remembered the birth of stars. One looked like a living constellation. Another was a swirling vortex of pure thought. A third seemed to be made of crystallized memories. Their leader, a being that appeared to be made of overlapping realities, spoke in a voice that existed in multiple times at once. "The balance is shifting. The human must leave." But something unexpected happened. The shadows in the palace began to move, gathering around James protectively. The crystal flowers in the garden started singing a song of defiance. Even the walls of the palace seemed to lean inward, as if listening. "Tell them," Keeper Lux whispered to James. "Tell them what you saw in the garden." James stood up straighter, facing the elder races without fear. "I saw the truth in the crystal reflections. Your kind didn't leave the Empire because you were afraid of the Queen's face. You left because you were afraid of what her existence means." The room temperature dropped. The constellation Elder flickered dangerously. "You understand nothing, human. I understand that the crystalline empire isn't named for its palace," James continued, remembering the Vanishing Diary's words. "It's named for what your people tried to hide here. The Queen's species, they're living crystals, aren't they? The original ones. The first conscious beings in the universe." The elder races moved back as one. The Queen's shadow waterfall rippled with emotion. "The prophecy speaks of one who will see without seeing," the memory crystal elder said. "One who will know our greatest truth without being destroyed by it. But it cannot be a human." James felt his notebook grow warm again. When he opened it, he found a single line written in a hand he'd never seen before. Some prophecies are not about what will happen, but about what already has. Suddenly, all the shadows in the palace froze. Every crystal stopped singing. Even the elder races fell silent, because there on the floor between them, a single crystal tear had fallen from behind the shadow waterfall. Where it landed, reality itself began to crack, showing glimpses of other worlds, other possibilities. And in these cracks, James saw something that changed everything he thought he knew about the universe. He saw why the Queen had to hide her face, not because it was dangerous to look upon, but because it showed the one truth the elder races had tried to bury. The universe wasn't born from darkness, as all species believed. It was born from light, and the Queen's kind were not just the first conscious beings. They were the universe's memory made flesh. As this revelation echoed through the chamber, the elder races did something no one expected. They bowed, not to the Queen, but to James. The prophecy never said the chosen one would be powerful. The reality-shifting elder said. It said they would be kind enough to see truth without seeking to own it. But before James could process this, warning bells began to ring again. This time, they sounded different, ancient and afraid. Because something was happening in the Shadow Garden. The crystals were starting to sing a song that hadn't been heard since the beginning of time. And in James's pocket, his notebook wrote its final warning. When truth awakens, even shadows must choose a side. The real test was never about seeing the Queen's face. It was about being worthy of what that sight would mean. Betrayal and truth. The day after the elder race's visit, James woke to find his room filled with floating crystals, each one showing a different memory that wasn't his own. In one, he saw the birth of the first star. In another, the moment consciousness first sparked in the universe. But the third crystal showed something that made his blood run cold, the true history of the crystalline empire. Long ago, the Queen species didn't hide their faces. They walked among the younger races, sharing knowledge and light. But one race, the Void Weavers, discovered that harvesting a crystal being's light could grant immortality. The great betrayal that followed forced the crystal beings into hiding, leading them to create the shadow veils that now protected them. As James watched these memories, his silver bracelets suddenly shattered, releasing a cloud of tiny light particles that formed words in the air. The greatest lies are the ones we tell ourselves. Look closer at the shadows. James' chin. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Keeper Vex, but something was wrong. His galaxy mask wasn't spinning. It was completely still. The Prime Minister requests your presence, Vex said, his voice lacking its usual chime-like quality. James followed Vex through corridors he'd never seen before, where the shadows seemed to whisper warnings. They arrived at a chamber deep within the palace, its walls made of what looked like frozen lightning. The Prime Minister wasn't what James expected. Instead of another masked figure, he saw a being made of shifting darkness and scattered points of light, like a living piece of space. James' chin. The Prime Minister's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. You've caused quite a problem for us. Us? James asked, noticing how the shadows in the room were trying to pull away from the Prime Minister. The Void Weavers didn't vanish. The Prime Minister's form rippled. We evolved. We learned to hide in plain sight, to wear the darkness we once feared. And now, after millennia of planning, you threaten everything. The truth hit James like a physical blow. The Prime Minister wasn't protecting the Queen. He was keeping her prisoner. The entire shadow system wasn't for protection. It was a cage. Suddenly, Keeper Vex's mask cracked, revealing not a face, but a void filled with hungry stars. We've been draining her light for centuries, using the shadow veils to hide our feeding. Every advisor who came close to learning the truth had an unfortunate accident. But they had made one crucial mistake. While they talked, James noticed something extraordinary. The shadows in the room weren't just pulling away from the Prime Minister. They were gathering around James, forming patterns that matched the broken pieces of his bracelet. "You don't understand what's really happening here," James said, his voice steady. "The shadows aren't yours to command. They never were." The Prime Minister laughed, a sound like dying galaxies. "And what would a human know of shadows?" "I know that true darkness isn't empty," James replied, remembering the crystal memories. "It's full of waiting light." At that moment, James's notebook flew from his pocket, its pages glowing with blinding intensity. The words written inside rose into the air, forming a sphere of light around him. Each word was a memory, a truth, a piece of the universe's original song. The shadows in the room began to change, revealing their true nature. They weren't darkness at all. They were light so pure it appeared dark to impure eyes. And now, after centuries of waiting, they had found someone worthy of their trust. The Prime Minister's form flickered in fear. "Stop him." But Keeper Vex's attack passed right through James. The shadow sphere protecting him wasn't just blocking attacks, it was revealing more truth. Every shadow it touched showed another layer of the Void Weaver's deception. Through the chaos, James heard the Queen's voice, not through speakers or shadows, but directly in his mind. "James, the crystal tear you saw yesterday, it wasn't just showing other worlds. It was showing the way back. The shadows aren't our prison. They're our path to freedom." The Prime Minister launched himself at James, his form splitting into 1,000 void-filled tentacles. But each one that touched the shadow sphere turned to pure light, revealing the final truth. The Void Weavers hadn't evolved past their need for light. They had become addicted to it. Their entire empire was built on stealing and storing light from crystal beings. James's notebook wrote one last message in his hands. "The choice comes now. Truth is a weapon that cuts both ways. To save her, you must be willing to become what no human has ever been, a bridge between shadow and light." As alarms blared through the palace, James made his decision. He stepped into the shadow waterfall that had appeared in the room, letting the truth-filled darkness flow through him. The last thing he saw before everything changed was his own reflection in the Prime Minister's void-filled form, and in it he saw his eyes beginning to shine with the same light as the Queen's. The universe held its breath, waiting to see what would happen when a human dared to become a conduit for the oldest power in existence. Because sometimes the greatest betrayal isn't what is done to us, it's what we refuse to become in response. The ultimate test. The transformation was both beautiful and terrifying. As the shadow waterfall flowed through James, his body became a prism of living light. Each drop of shadow that touched him revealed another piece of the universe's original melody, the song of creation that the crystal beings had preserved since the beginning of time. But the Void Weavers weren't going to let their centuries of power slip away easily. The Prime Minister's form exploded into a storm of anti-light, turning everything it touched into hungry darkness. The frozen lightning walls began to crack, revealing the void between spaces. "You fool!" The Prime Minister's voice echoed from 1,000 points of emptiness. "Do you think you're the first to try changing into something more? Look." The air around them shattered like glass, revealing hundreds of crystallized figures floating in the void. Previous advisors who had tried to transform and failed, their bodies frozen between light and shadow. But something was different about James. Where the others had tried to take the power for themselves, he was letting it flow through him, becoming not a vessel, but a bridge. His notebook, now floating in the air, began to write in both light and shadow simultaneously. The final truth. Light is not meant to be contained. It is meant to be shared. Suddenly, Keeper Lux burst into the chamber, her galaxy mask burning away to reveal her true form. She wasn't a Void Weaver at all, but a crystal being in disguise, working as a spy within their ranks. "James," she called out, her voice carrying the weight of stars. "The Queen is breaking free, but the palace defenses are turning against her." The Void Weavers linked them to their own essence. Through his new light-touched senses, James could feel it. The entire palace was becoming a battleground between light and void. In the Shadow Garden, The crystal flowers were singing battle hymns that hadn't been heard since the first war between light and darkness. The shadows themselves were choosing sides, some returning to their true light nature, others corrupted by centuries of void exposure. James knew what he had to do. Using his transformed state, he began to dance, not a human dance, but the pattern dance of the crystal beings that he'd seen in the memory crystals. Each step left traces of pure light that formed complex geometric patterns on the floor. The Prime Minister laughed. "You think ancient crystal magic can stop us? We've had millennia to prepare." "This isn't about stopping you," James replied, his voice now carrying harmonics that made reality vibrate. "It's about remembering." The patterns he was drawing began to glow, not with borrowed light, but with remembered light. The original light that all beings carried within them, even the void weavers. In the center of the chamber, a crystal tear, just like the one from before, fell from James's transformed eye. But when it hit the pattern, instead of cracking reality, it began to heal it. The Prime Minister screamed as long-buried memories surfaced. The void weavers hadn't always been creatures of darkness. They were among the first children of the crystal beings, taught to share and preserve light. Their fall into darkness hadn't been from evil, but from fear. Fear of losing the light they loved so much that they tried to possess it. Through the chaos, James heard the Queen's voice, stronger than ever. The palace core. James, the core. He understood. The entire palace was built around a single pure crystal, the last uncorrupted piece of the original universe. The void weavers had been using it as a prison, but it was meant to be a bridge. Racing through corridors that were alternately dissolving into void or blazing with remembered light, James headed for the heart of the palace. Behind him, the Prime Minister's forces gave chase, their void forms leaving trails of anti-light that ate through reality itself. But James wasn't alone. The shadow creatures from the garden, now revealed as tiny fragments of the original light, flew with him like a storm of living stars. His notebook floated beside him, its pages now made of pure crystal, writing the true history of the universe with every step he took. When he reached the core chamber, what he saw took his breath away. The Queen was there, no longer hidden behind the shadow waterfall. But James kept his promise. He didn't look at her face. Instead, he looked at her reflection in the core crystal, understanding at last why the crystal beings had to hide themselves. They weren't just beautiful. They were the original template for all beauty in the universe. Their light didn't blind or destroy. It revealed every living thing's connection to the first moment of creation. "Together," the Queen asked, holding out a hand made of living light. "Together," James replied, taking her hand without looking at her face. As void and light clashed around them, as reality itself hung in the balance, the human who dared to become a bridge and the Queen who carried the universe's first light prepared to remind creation of its true nature. The notebook wrote its final words before transforming completely into crystal. "Some bridges are built of steel and stone. Others are built of trust and truth. But the strongest bridges are built of choices, choosing to see beauty without trying to possess it, choosing to hold power without being corrupted by it, choosing to love what is different without trying to change it." And in that moment, as James and the Queen faced the void together, the ultimate test wasn't about power or transformation or even survival. It was about remembering what the universe had forgotten. That light and shadow were never meant to be enemies, but partners in an eternal dance. And sometimes, it takes a human heart to remind immortal beings of their own forgotten truths. The final choice. The palace core pulsed with blinding power as James and the Queen joined hands. But instead of channeling the light as the void weavers had done, they began to dance. Not the crystal pattern dance from before, but something entirely new. A dance of shadow and light combined. Each step they took changed the very fabric of the palace. Walls of frozen lightning melted into cascades of living starlight. The void-touched shadows transformed back into their original state. Not darkness, not light, but the space between heartbeats where both existed together. Impossible. The Prime Minister's voice shattered into 1,000 echoes. No crystal being can touch shadow without burning. No human can channel pure light without breaking. That's because they're not channeling the power. Keeper Lux realized, her true crystal form glowing with understanding. They're setting it free. The truth of the universe wasn't in its light or its darkness, but in the dance between them. The crystal beings hadn't been meant to guard the light. They were meant to teach others how to dance with it. James's transformed body began to sing the universe's original song, but with a new harmony added. A human melody of growth, change, and endless possibility. Where this hybrid song touched the void-corrupted areas, they didn't burn or break, but remembered what they used to be. The Prime Minister launched a final, desperate attack. His void form split the air into razor-sharp shards of anti-light. If we can't have the light, no one will. Better the void than sharing power. But something extraordinary happened. As the void shards flew toward James and the Queen, the crystallized notebook, now floating above them, burst into countless pages of living crystal. Each page caught a void shard and showed it its own story, its own forgotten truth. The Void Weavers saw themselves as they once were, children of light who danced with shadows. Their fear of losing the light had turned them into the very darkness they feared. But fear wasn't their only legacy. James, still keeping his promise never to look directly at the Queen's face, spoke in a voice that carried both human compassion and crystal resonance. Your people weren't wrong to love the light. You were wrong to think you could own it. From within the core crystal, ancient memories awakened. The first crystal being teaching the first Void Weaver to dance. The joy of sharing light rather than containing it. The moment when fear first crept in, and how it could have been different. The Queen, her light now dancing freely with the shadows instead of hiding behind them, added her own voice. We were wrong too. We hid ourselves away instead of helping you remember. We chose protection over connection. The Prime Minister's form began to waver, but the prophecy, it spoke of one who would destroy us. No, James smiled, understanding at last. It spoke of one who would remind us, all of us. He held out his free hand to the Prime Minister, offering not conquest or submission, but dance. Light isn't meant to be kept or taken or owned. It's meant to be shared in an eternal dance with shadow. That's the balance the universe needs. As if responding to this truth, the palace core crystal began to pulse with a new kind of light, not the harsh brilliance of pure energy, but the gentle glow of remembered joy. It spread through the palace, touching everything with its dance of revelation. The Void Weavers, their forms trembling between darkness and light, faced their choice. The Prime Minister looked at James's offered hand, seeing in it not the end of his people, but their redemption. How? He asked, his voice small and afraid. How can we dance again after so long in darkness? James's answer came not in words but in action. Still holding the Queen's hand, never looking at her face, he began to hum Earth's simplest song, a lullaby his mother had sung to him. The crystal light picked up the tune, the shadows learned its rhythm, and slowly, the very particles of reality began to dance again. The notebook, now fully transformed into a crystal codex, wrote its final truth in letters made of dancing light and shadow. The greatest power isn't in seeing or hiding, in taking or giving. It's in the courage to keep dancing even when you've forgotten the steps. One by one, the Void Weavers remembered how to dance. Their void forms softened, becoming spaces where light and shadow could play together. The crystallized advisors of the past, frozen between states, began to thaw, not into what they were, but into teachers of the dance they had glimpsed before their transformation. As the dance spread through the palace, then the empire, then the galaxy itself, James finally understood why he had been chosen, not because he was special or powerful or wise, but because humans, in all their brief, bright lives, never stopped trying to dance with both light and shadow. The Queen's voice, now carrying both crystal song and shadow whispers, asked the question that would change everything. James Chin, keeper of balance, bridge between states, would you like to see my face now? And James, smiling at the dance of light and shadow around them, gave the answer that proved he had been worthy all along. I already see you, my friend, not with my eyes, but with the truth we've created together. And that's the most beautiful sight of all. The universe, watching through every crystal and shadow, every light and void, learned a new dance that day. And in the space between heartbeats, where light and shadow meet, a human's choice to trust without seeing became the step that taught infinity how to dance again.